Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Alberta AgriSystems Living Lab, welcome, including Dr. McKenzie. I'd like to take this moment to acknowledge, as a member of the Alberta AgriSystems Living Lab team, that we're grateful to live, work, and be in relation with people from many traditional territories covering all regions of Alberta. This acknowledgement is to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improving relationships and our own understanding of local Indigenous people, their cultures, and their knowledge. So with that, I'd like to take a moment to introduce Dr. McKenzie. He's been an amazing resource for producers in Alberta. He worked for Alberta Agriculture from 1975 to 2013, which is 38 years. He's a retired agronomy research scientist. He graduated from the University of Alberta with a Bachelor of Science, double major in soil and plant science, as well as a PhD in soil fertility and chemistry and plant nutrition from the University of Saskatchewan. He led the agronomy research program across Alberta for Alberta Agriculture, specializing in soil fertility and agronomic research with dryland and irrigated crop production. He's also an adjunct professor for the University of Lethbridge. And since his retirement from Alberta Agriculture, he spent countless hours doing consulting and contracting work for all sorts of companies and some very interesting projects, including the Blood Tribe, where he reclaimed 5,000 acres of wind-eroded land after a stubble fire. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ross McKenzie to our online audience.
So thanks again very much, Adrian, for inviting me to speak tonight and for your kind introduction. For those of you that are attending tonight, Adrian actually asked if I could spend a bit of time just talking about how soils in Alberta have formed and developed, then talk a bit about soil testing and soil test interpretation, then kind of relate all those things to soil health and soil quality. And I thought I'd be happy to do that in about 4 hours, and she said, "No, Ross, you better do that in 1 hour." So we'll see how we make out. No, Adrian did introduce me, but I just was going to remind you, I spent most of my career, 32 years or 38 years, where I worked for Alberta Agriculture doing mostly soil fertility and fertilizer research, a lot of agronomy work, and doing some problem soil management research as well. And after I retired in 2013, as Adrian mentioned, I did contract work for various organizations. But 2 years ago, I decided enough is enough, and so I've fully retired 2 years ago. Now I just do occasional fun things like this on a volunteer basis, writing for Grain News, that sort of things. Like I do things just for the fun of it now. So let's have some fun and let's talk about soils and how soils across Alberta have formed and developed. So here's just a general soil map of Alberta. We see down in the southeast corner, we have the brown soils. As we move north and west, we have the dark brown, then thin black, black, gray, and then up in the Peace River region, we have the dark gray and gray wooded soils. So the question always is that how did the soils that we have get here? How did they form and develop? So we're able to start down here in the southeast corner of Alberta. This would be a very typical soil profile of a brown soil in the brown soil zone. Typically, we have a fairly narrow, thin AH horizon. H stands for humus, and a zone of mineral enrichment, a BM horizon, M standing for mineral enrichment. And then we get into a C horizon. In this case, it's got an accumulation of carbonates. That's what gives us a little light color. So how did soil form and develop? Well, if we kind of stop and think, what was the climate like in this area after the last glaciation receded 10 to 12,000 years ago? Well, it was very hot and very dry compared to the rest of the province. As a result, the native vegetation was typically short prairie grasses. So short prairie grasses, always limited with water, didn't really add all that much organic matter to the soil surface. So as a result, not a lot of organic matter was added. So our soil colors are brown in color. Typically, these soils have about 3% organic matter in their native state. So that's really, it was really the climate which influenced the vegetation, which influenced these soils to develop. So let's now just move over to the west and to the north in the dark brown soil zone. Now, why are these soils dark brown in color? Well, really the main reason is the soils in this region had a little higher precipitation, a little lower evapotranspiration, so a little wetter, not quite as hot. So then we would have we'd have mixed prairie grasses growing, would add organic matter to the soil over 10,000 years. So a little bit more organic matter was added, And so that AH horizon is a little darker in color, dark brown, and has about 4, sometimes 4.5% organic matter. So then as we continue moving north into the black soils, we have the kind of a thin black soil zone, and then the black soils. Thin black typically have 6 to 8% organic matter. Black soils have 8 to 10% organic matter. Again, thinking about what was the climate like for the last 10,000 years. Well, these soils had a little higher precipitation and not quite as hot, not quite as dry, so more moisture available for plant growth. So the native vegetation was more lush fescue grasses growing, more water, more available water, more grass growth, more root development, more organic matter added to the soil. As a result, these soils are black in color with a higher organic matter. Then as we continue to move north into the gray soils and the dark gray soils, well, why do these soils turn gray? Well, as we move north, evapotranspiration is much lower, much shorter growing season, a little bit higher precipitation in the black soils, and not much. It's really just cooler and a shorter growing season. So then we shift from fescue type grasses into parkland and then boreal forest vegetation. When we have boreal forest vegetation, instead of having nice, lush, fibrous roots and like the grasses have, trees don't have that. But where you wind up is you have a lot of very acidic pine needles and spruce needles, and so you have the coniferous and deciduous vegetation with the leaves on the soil surface. They tend to be quite acidic, and so over 10,000 years of soil development, those acids in the leaf and residue, organic residue in this LFH leaf litter, caused the organic matter to actually, and the clays, as a matter of fact, leach down into the B horizon, leaving a very ashy gray color. So once those soils were brushed and cleared, the farmer started farming them, we were left with a very ashy gray colored soil, and that's why they're referred to as gray soils. They're because of the color, and because of the forest vegetation, they're sometimes referred to as gray wooded soils. So in a nutshell, that's the reason why we have these different soil zones across the province. And having mentioned that, we have other soils though that are what we call azonal. For example, all of the shaded area here is an area where we tend to find solonetzic soils. These soils were formed, you would find them in all soil zones, but they were under the soils as they formed and developed, they were underlain by marine shales high in sodium. So then we have these solonetzic soils formed and developed. So we have zonal soils, but we have azonal soils as well. So let's just kind of talk about, just briefly review how soils are formed and developed. So in the brown soils, as an example, the climate was the major dominant influence. High evapotranspiration, low precipitation, short prairie grasses with native vegetation. As a result, lower organic matter levels are added to the soil, hence we have the brown soil color. Then we move into central Alberta where the black soils are. Again, climate is a dominant factor dictating the kind of vegetation that we have. We're predominantly fescue grasses, much more vigorous in their growth because of additional moisture, more organic matter out of the soil, giving the soils a black color. When we move into the dark gray and gray soils, where we have parkland and boreal forest vegetation, again, that vegetation is dictated by the climate with the low evapotranspiration, higher precipitation, shorter growing season, and as a result, that organic material that was on a leaf surface, so the leaf litter on the soil surface is very acidic, caused soil surface to be leached, and so the topsoil is gray in color. So that, in a nutshell, really points to climate and vegetation being two very dominant factors in how soils are formed and developed over the last 10 to 12,000 years. So climate and vegetation are critically important, but there's a number of other factors. So you start thinking on your own farms, what are some of the other factors that would have influenced how soil is formed and developed? Well, one is the parent material on which those soils develop. And I'll talk about that in a minute and explain that. Topography, how do the soils compare on an upper slope position versus a mid slope versus a lower slope position? So topography is fairly dominant. And then the surface drainage, depending on the topography, that affects surface drainage. And then parent material, whether it's the sandy material or more clay material, affects internal soil drainage. So that's the water aspect. And that also has an important or plays an important role in how soils are formed and developed. And finally, time. So it's taken, literally thousands of years for our soils to form and develop. And now we actually have one new factor, in the last 150 years that have really influenced how soils have changed, and that's really our human activities. With cultivated agriculture coming into play, um, various types of industries, the oil and gas industry, country residential acreages, roads, fragmentation of our land. We've done a lot of things in the last 150 years with our human activities to influence how our soils are now forming and changing. So now we'll talk a little bit about soil parent material. How did the soils on your farm actually get here? And we stop and think that 10 to 12,000 years ago, well, about 12,000 years ago, all of the province of what is now the province of Alberta was covered in a glacial ice sheet about a mile thick across the entire province, and in fact across all of the plains of Western Canada. And we wound up with underneath that glacial ice sheet, we found conditions that we would call maybe hummocky moraine. So the land was quite rolling, and typically the soil texture under the material is often a loam to clay loam. In other areas under the glacial ice sheet, we would call it a ground moraine, where the land was maybe gently rolling versus more strongly rolling under the hummocky moraine. And these soils tend to be somewhat stony to moderately stony to quite stony, depending on how things were laid down. And we also have to keep in mind that between about 10,000 and 12,000 years ago, it took about 2,000 years for that glacial ice sheet to melt and retreat from the south end of the province to the north end of the province. So all that glacial meltwater had to go somewhere, so it flowed across the landscape. And so that had a significant impact on how there was deposition and where our soils have formed and developed on your farm and around you. And typically, as the water started flowing off glaciers, and these glaciers would be loaded with sand, silt, and clay and stones, the first thing that would actually settle out is what we call outwash material, or sands and gravel. So wherever you see gravel pits in your region, those are what we would call outwash areas, where the gravels were the first thing to be deposited as the water was coming off the ice sheet. Then as the water continued to flow across the landscape that it was moving, the first things that would settle out are the sands, the silts and clays would predominantly stay suspended in the water. And so we'd have what we call fluvial material, typically a sandy loam to loamy sand texture, so quite sandy. And as the water continued to move across the landscape, it would start to slow down. And so we get more silts and clay settling out, and we call where the water was moving slowly across the landscape. That material we call fluvial lacustrine, typically texture-wise would be a loam to clay loam in texture. And then finally, if the water didn't flow into a great glacial meltwater channel, and often to Saskatchewan, sometimes it would form glacial lakes, like around Lethbridge, Coaldale, Drumheller, Edmonton regions, or glacial lakes throughout the province. And so we call that material lacustrine, and predominantly the soil texture is clay, because the clay that was suspended in that water would settle in the glacial lake and then leaving the clay material behind. So that is very briefly the kinds of parent materials we have across Alberta, and it's very simplistic the way I've described it, but hopefully it'll kind of give you an understanding. So the main types would be glacial till deposits. We have oftentimes we have quite variable texture, but usually it's more in the clay loam category. Topography would be anywhere from gently rolling to severely rolling. Often the soil profiles will have some stones in it, so they're moderately stony. Then we have the fluvial materials, which are sandy loam to loamy sand. And it was not uncommon to find fluvial areas that then would be reworked by the wind. And we would call that aeolian material when it was redeposited by the wind. Fortunately, we don't have a lot of agricultural soils that we actually crop that are actually farming that category when they're more of a loamy sand to aeolian deposited. Once we get into the fluvial lacustrine, that's the water sorted materials. Typically, the textures are loam to clay loam. Usually very few stones. You'll find occasional stones that were rafted in on ice, but generally relatively stone-free. Typically, the topography would be undulating to maybe very gently rolling. And in my mind, these are some of the very nicest soils, but usually topography is good water holding capacity, good water infiltration rates. So these are very nice soils to work with. Lacustrine soils, basically the old glacial lake bed areas. These are typically very fine textured, heavy soils, high in clay. We are relatively stone-free. Topography usually level to just undulating. So very nice topography, but higher because they have a higher clay content, they have a low water infiltration rate, they hold water very well. So again, there's kind of a nutshell in terms of the parent materials that we have to deal with now. I've also mentioned the topography is very important, especially on the glacial till soils. Topography really became a dominant soil forming factor where topography combined with the slopes and that influence water movement and water infiltration. And so typically this is just a two-dimensional graph here where you just have on the upper slopes, when the rain would come down, a lot of that rain would just flow off. You wouldn't get a lot of soil development. You'd have shorter prairie grasses because of limitations of moisture in the upper slopes. A little more precipitation would penetrate and infiltrate into the mid-slope positions, so a little bit better soil development on the mid-slope. And down at the lower slope positions, usually better moisture, better grass growth, better organic matter additions to the soil. So you'll have quite different soil profiles from the upper slope to the lower slope. But unfortunately, our fields often aren't very simple like that. They tend to be quite complex and dynamic with lots of slopes in different directions. The steepness of the slope and the length of the slope. So the soils wind up being quite variable in terms of how they formed and developed on lands that are quite rolling. So I just took this picture just south of Lethbridge. So here we see hilltops, lower slope position, another hilltop, and over short distances, how do the soil profiles actually vary? Well, just for fun, I'll just show you three soil profiles. This one, and they're all within about not even 100 yards of each other. This is a lower slope position. Organic matter in this A horizon would be about 4%. The B horizon looks nice, clean C horizon. This would be a mid-slope soil core, not quite as dark a color, so organic matter will probably be in the range of 3%. And then our C horizon would start right about here, a little more carbonates, a little lighter in color, so a little less soil profile development. And then this core I took in the upper slope position. So this is the top soil right here. You can see it's much lighter in color, probably about 2% organic matter. And then our C horizon material, our subsoil, really starts at about 8 inches and a much lighter in color. You can see lots of white there. That's an indication of calcium carbonate, so much less soil profile development in upper slope position. So that gives you a bit of a sense of how soils can change over very short distances, just simply because of topography and the way the water flowed over the landscape and actually flowed the internal drainage to move moisture down into the soil profile, maybe leach some of the salts and carbonates out of the soil profile. So what I'd like you to do now is just kind of think about what are some of the soil characteristics when we're talking about soil quality and soil health. What are some of the soil characteristics of, say, just an upper slope position versus a lower slope position? We'll kind of think of what are some of the chemical characteristics and the physical characteristics. So I've just listed them here, some of them, not all of them. But first of all, in an upper slope position, the topsoil is going to be thinner. So that AP horizon, AP standing for the plow layer, is going to be thinner. So there's going to be less soil organic matter. Typically, when there's less soil organic matter at the soils in that surface soil, we're going to have poor structure. Possibly it's undergone some erosion both before we started to cultivate the fields over many years of soil development, and then after we started farming the lands. Upper slopes often tended to erode both by water and by wind. Typically, the topsoil is relatively shallow, which means the sea horizon, that subsoil layer, is going to be quite a bit closer to the soil surface versus a lower slope position. Oftentimes on glacial till material, that sea horizon can be rather dense and might even restrict root growth and root penetration down into the subsoil. Typically, the surface soils, because they're lower in organic matter, might crust more easily after rain. So if you get a rain right after you seed, you might have poor germination and emergence. Actually, poor emergence just because of the crusting. Typically, because we have poor structure or lower organic matter, typically the water infiltration rate and is poor in the upper slope positions. And as a result, lower water holding capacity with lower organic matter and less water stored. So the upper slopes are going to suffer from the lack of being able to have water infiltrate and then being held in the upper slope positions. In terms of the chemical characteristics, oftentimes soil fertility is lower just because we have lower organic matter, and that's really the storehouse of many of the nutrients we have that plants need. And typically, if we have lower organic matter, we have less nutrient cycling, less nutrients released from the organic matter for plant growth. So we have, as a general rule, poorer soil fertility and nutrient status in our hilltop soils, our upper slope positions versus lower slope. And oftentimes, when we start talking about other characteristics like soil pH, typically the soil pH is often much higher on that upper slope position on hilltops. So how does that compare then, these soil characteristics, how does that compare to in the lower slopes versus the upper slopes? So typically the topsoil is going to be deeper, so the AP horizon is going to be deeper, and there might even be some deposition in that lower slope position from water erosion moving some of that soil from upper slope to lower slope. Typically, much better organic matter, much better structure, less susceptible to soil crusting, which means better crop emergence. With that better structural organic matter, we have better water infiltration. We have a higher ability to hold the water when it does move into the soil with increased organic matter levels. And as a result, we can store more water in that lower slope position after a rain than we can for an upper slope position. Now, sometimes some of these lower slope positions actually wind up being depressional. And so sometimes after a rain or a snow melt, we have standing water. And sometimes that might contribute to a high water table. So that would be maybe a negative that we might see. In terms of the chemical side of things, typically we have higher nutrient levels with better soil fertility. So we have higher organic matter, a higher storehouse of nutrients being held in that organic matter, more organic matter breaking down and nutrient cycling, releasing nutrients for plant growth. And so that's very positive. And typically soil pH is much lower in the lower slope positions. Now, again, the downside for these depressional areas, if we have a high water table within, say, a water table within 2 meters of soil surface, sometimes on these lower slope positions, then they are greater potential for development of soil salinity. We'll talk about soil salinity and testing for it in a few minutes. So what are some of the effects of slope position on crop growth? Well, if you kind of think in your own situation, how does the slope position affect nutrient availability across your fields? How are the soil moisture reserves and subsoil in upper slope versus lower slope positions? How does that affect crop germination, emergence, and crop growth? And how does that affect rooting ability? So we always want to be thinking about what are the different characteristics we have on our soils across our fields, and where are those characteristics going to be beneficial to help increase crop yield, and where are some of those characteristics less advantageous and actually they maybe be negative and will result in reduced crop yield potential. So here are some of the things we know. We know that soils can vary across rolling landscapes. Uniquely different soil areas of a field have varying soil factors, so that some of them we just talked about, nutrient levels, and as a result, yield potential. And as a result, these different soil areas have different fertilizer requirements. So one of the challenges if you do have lands that are more rolling and more variable, so the soils are more variable, how uniquely different are the soils in your fields? Would variable rate fertilizer applications be beneficial? That's something to think about. And as I look across Alberta, probably 30 to 35% of our landscape has enough variability that variable rate fertilizer might actually have a place, but probably only about 12 to 15% of our land across Alberta actually has rural farmers actually kind of take advantage of variable rate fertilizer application. So one of the things you may want to do is if you think that is something that is worth pursuing, determine how the nutrients should be managed in your field, in different parts of your field. If you think that there's enough variability, maybe having a chat with precision agronomists to maybe explore that further. So what are some of the things that we really would like to know about our soils? Well, one, we can certainly do soil testing. When we do soil testing, we determine nitrogen, phosphorus, K stands for potassium, S for sulfur. Those are typically the four nutrients that are more commonly deficient in our soils across Alberta. But it's also nice to know a lot about other characteristics, like what's the soil pH like and how does it vary both across landscape and with depth? What's your soil organic matter levels across landscape? What is your soil EC like? EC stands for electrical conductivity, which is a measure of salinity. And then even just texture, but you don't really have to have a lab tech do that. There's very good soil maps we have across the province, and you can look at the soil maps for your farm and see what the soil texture is and even what the parent geologic material is to help you understand your land better. Then there's other things we can test for: cation exchange capacity, base saturation, and I'll talk about those characteristics in a few minutes. What else should you know? Well, I really like to know what does the parent material look like in a field, and it's not uncommon to have 2 or 3 different parent materials, even on 1/4 section. And so I'd like to know what are the parent materials like. That tells me a lot about, what are the soil textures like, what are the water holding capacity, infiltration rates. It kind of will help me understand what sort of variation you're going to be looking at. And then some of the chemical characteristics, for example, like we talked about pH, organic matter, and EC. How do these change with soil depth and landscape, particularly pH and EC? So before we start talking about soil analysis and interpretation, and I don't really want to take any time talking about soil testing. We could spend quite a bit of time talking about how to do it, but what depths are appropriate. I'm really big on doing a 0 to 6, a 6 to 12, and a 12 to 24 inch depth, particularly for nitrogen and sulfur because they're mobile in soil. We want to see where they are. And then where should you test? Well, on very uniform fields, just one set of samples for a field, on a 1/4 section base will be adequate. We've got variable soils. You might want to have 3 or 4 different, uniquely different soil areas, slope positions where you want to sample, decide what to do. And if you're going to be doing that, you might want to be working with a precision agronomist. Then we have to decide what soil test method should be used and what does it tell you, and that's what I'll talk about next. This is just a generalized soil test report that we made up a number of years ago. Usually at the top, it's basically the farm information, the field information, the legal land location, and if the farmer has a field name for it, and then information on soil sampling, analysis dates. Then we have across here the nutrient analysis that we'd have done. That's all in parts per million, and then some of the nutrients are converted from parts per million to pounds per acre. Then there's soil quality things we might want to have analyzed, like pH, electrical conductivity, organic matter, and things like soil texture. And then there's other things we can look at as well. Then finally, you get the base of the bottom of the report. The lab will give you fertilizer recommendations. So let's kind of go through this soil test report and talk about what does it actually tell you, and then help you kind of interpret it. So really there's what we call macronutrients. These are the nutrients that are required in the greatest amounts. The ones that I'm most interested in are nitrate, nitrogen. We're sort of testing for nitrate. That's the form of nitrogen that plants take up. That's the plant available form that we test. And so I'm very interested in that. Typically down to 24 inches. So here you can see it's analyzed for 0 to 6, 6 to 12, and 12 to 24 inch depth. Then we test for phosphorus, and we test it as PO4. It's phosphate, but that's the form that plants actually take up. Then we test for potassium, K. It's in the elemental form. That's the way plants take up potassium. And then sulfate sulfur is also taken up as SO4, similar to nitrate. Both of them are negatively charged and will leach in soil. So we want to test 0 to 6, 6 to 12, and 12 to 24 inches for those nutrients. But for phosphorus and potassium, they're not mobile. We've done all our soil test calibration in Alberta for the last 40 years with the 0 to 6 inch depth. Now, there are other macronutrients, calcium and magnesium, and generally we don't have to worry about testing for those. Our soils across Alberta are typically loaded with calcium and magnesium. We can certainly test for them, and you might want to do it maybe once every 5 years. It's for curiosity to see what they're at, but it's really not necessary to be a very rare occurrence where you might run into a calcium deficiency or a magnesium deficiency. And then we have the micronutrients. These are the nutrients that are required in very, very small amounts. You might only be required in, a 1/4 of a pound or a 1/2 a pound or even a 1/10 of a pound per acre. So they're required in very low amounts. Two of the nutrients that are tested for often by labs are boron and chloride. But our work is very clearly showing that the soil tests that are used by labs don't work. We need to develop better tests that are more accurate and correlate with what's in the soil with what crops will respond to. So the labs will test for them, but if you get a recommendation for either of these two nutrients, always be getting a second or third opinion because often you don't need these nutrients. Then there's copper, iron, manganese, and zinc. These are the metal micronutrients. An extraction solution called DTPA is used for these four, and we can do a fairly good job of predicting when we need these. Now, how do we convert? And these are, I should mention, these are all determined in parts per million. Then for NPK and S, most labs will convert those to pounds per acre. How do we convert ppm to pounds per acre? Well, first of all, ppm stands for parts per million. And we want to convert to pounds per acre. And if we kind of think of, if we have 1 acre of land, 6 inches deep, that weighs about 2 million pounds. So if we have a 0 to 6 inch depth, it if we have parts per million and we just multiply it by 2, that's going to be very close to pounds per acre. It varies a little bit depending if it's a sandy soil or a clay soil, but it's pretty close, and so that's the way it's done. So you have a 0 to 6 inch depth, we multiply by 2. So for example, for phosphorus, the parts per million is 11 multiplied by 2, so it's 22 pounds per acre. If you have a 12-inch depth, like a 12 to 24-inch depth, which I like to do for the subsoil, that would weigh 4 million pounds. So parts per million multiplied by 4 gives us pounds per acre, and that works out quite nicely. Now, sometimes some agronomists might do is a 6 to 24-inch depth sample rather than split it out into two depths. They'll just do one depth. So it's an 18-inch depth. That 18-inch depth will actually weigh 6 million pounds. So then you multiply parts per million by 6 to come up with pounds per acre. I much prefer not to have more than a 12-inch depth sample and multiply it by 4. The bigger the sample, the more you have to multiply it by, and the greater you can be out if you have any kind of variation. So the next thing we'll talk about is soil pH, and I think that we're probably just you're not going to be able to quite see it with um, the picture over here. But anyway, here's soil pH. What is soil pH? Well, really, pH stands for power of hydrogen. So really what we're doing is determining the hydrogen ion concentration in the soil. So we're trying to determine the concentration of hydrogen ions versus hydroxyl ions, which are the OH, negatively charged OH ions. And if you have a pH of 7.0, that's neutral. The concentration of the hydrogen ions and the hydroxyl ions is equal. But typically, I sort of assume that once your soil pH is between 6.5 and 7.5, that's very close to neutral, and that's perfect. People often ask, what is an ideal pH? Well, in my mind, as long as your surface soil is between a pH of 6 and a pH of 8, that range is just fine. Some people get worried when their pH is 7.5 to 8, and they think, well, phosphorus is going to be less available. Well, I don't worry about that. I've done a lot of work with phosphorus, and it's not something I really get very concerned about. As long as your pH range is there, that's just fine. But once you drop below 6, I start to become a bit more concerned. 5.5 to 6, I consider moderately acidic. 5.5 to 5, I consider strongly acidic. So I'm certainly encouraging farmers, once your surface soil pH has dropped to that level, watch and monitor very closely. And once your soil pH drops to less than 5, I consider that very strongly acidic. I'd be concerned, and I'd certainly be doing further investigation. And then at the other end, once you should be worried if your soil pHs are quite high. But once your pHs are at 8.4 or higher, very often that indicates you've got a sodic soil, like a solenitic soil, high in sodium. That sodium will cause the formation of things like sodium hydroxide, which is a very strong base, and really jack up the chemistry, the pH of your soil. So that's not good. So if you see a surface soil pH of 8.4, again, be concerned and be talking to an agronomist and investigate further. Now, sometimes you'll see on soil test reports something called buffer pH. Labs in Eastern Canada and the US will often determine buffer pH if your soil pH is less than 6. And that's simply something that they do to develop a lime recommendation. It's a very simplistic test. We've never calibrated that to Western Canadian soils, so I don't recommend we use that. But if once your soil pHs are dropping and you're wondering about putting on lime, the best thing to do is actually do a lime requirement test. Now, Agriculture has several different methods that we would recommend. And so just basically have the lab do a lime requirement test, but actually develop a calibration curve specifically for your soil to determine what application rate of lime you need to hit a certain pH level. And that's a much better way to do it. Now, for other soil quality factors, one of them, next one over here, you can't see it, it's hidden, but is EC, it stands for electrical conductivity. Electrical conductivity is the diagnostic tool for salinity, and really what we're doing is measuring soluble salts. And really all we're doing is taking a soil sample, saturating it with water, let it sit overnight, then we use a Buckner funnel and suck the water out, and then we test that extract of water, see how much electricity will conduct, and that'll tell us just how salty that soil is. And it's a procedure that works very well. The units that are used are called decisiemens per meter. Some labs use different units, but so it'd be DS, so lowercase d, capital S / meter. And as long as you're less than 1, that's fine. And most soils will test at less than 0.5, and that is just fine. So I would consider that a normal surface soil. If your soil is at 2 decisiemens per meter, I start to become concerned. Just as an example, if your soil is varying between 2 and 6, you'll lose 5 to 10% of your yield potential with wheat when your soil is testing 2. Once you get up to 6, you can start to lose 60 to 80% of yield potential for a crop like wheat. So when I see an EC level of between 2 and 6, I call that hidden salinity. You can't see the salts, but you definitely want to investigate further, do more soil testing, more analysis to see just how bad it really is, and maybe consult with an agronomist to see how can you start managing that problem that would be developing. If you have a level of 10 decisiemens per meter, that's when you start to see white salts on the soil surface. If you see things like this in your field, where it's very, very white, almost like snow, this field here would have had an EC of about 20 decisiemens per meter, and it will grow nothing. But even between 2 and 6, that's where you start to lose yield potential, and you want to be concerned. The next thing is soil organic matter. People often say, well, what's an ideal soil organic matter? Well, if you're farming in the Medicine Hat area versus the Vegreville area, two very different soil zones, so two very different levels of what would be ideal for organic matter. Typically in the brown soil zone in the Medicine Hat, Brooks, Oyen, Tabor area, if your brown soil has an organic matter level of 3%, that's good. If it's 3.5, that's excellent. That's as good as it's going to get, but it'll be in a steady state or equilibrium by that point. For dark brown soils, probably about 4 to 4.5%. Thin black soils would be 6 to 8% would be the target you want to be in. Black soils, 8 to 10%. Then we get back into the darker and gray soils in the range of 3 to 4%, perhaps even a little bit higher than that. We have good moisture conditions and you're doing a good job of cropping. But depending on the soil zone you're in, you would have a different level of organic matter that we would consider ideal. The next thing we'll talk about is base cation saturation. Basically, we can determine something called cation exchange capacity, and the abbreviation for it is CEC, and really just the ability of the soils to hold cations, and the dominant base cations are calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium, and these are what would give soils a higher pH. If we have other cations, negatively or positively charged cations are things like hydrogen, and we don't want a lot of hydrogen in our soil. That's what gives us our lower pH. And typically, our cation exchange capacity will increase with clay content. In this particular case, this is a loam soil, and so the cation exchange capacity would be around 20 milliequivalents per liter for 100 gram soil sample. And that would be typical as as the EC increases, those numbers might go up to 30 to 40. But if you have a sandy soil, the cation exchange capacity might only be 10. So soil texture really is a determining factor for how the soil can actually hold cations. And so we can actually do a test for this, but it doesn't change from year to year. So you can test for it once, and that you don't need to ever test for it again, as long as you're sampling in the same spots. And then when we do a test for base saturation, as long as your soil pH is above 7, your percent base saturation will always be 100. Once you drop below a pH of 7, then that means there's starting to be hydronions present, and then we want to look at what is the percentage of, say, calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium on the exchange states. Some agronomists will actually use this information, and I'll look at ratios of calcium, magnesium. Can't actually see it over here on the soil test report, but it actually shows the calcium, magnesium ratio. A number of agronomists across Alberta have used this in the past to make fertilizer recommendations. My advice would be, if you have an agronomist that's doing this, I would be extremely concerned. There's not a reputable agronomist or research scientist that I know who would ever make recommendations based on calcium, magnesium, and potassium ratios. That's just very, very flawed. It comes from the U.S., which was very flawed. They don't use it there. We certainly shouldn't be using it in Western Canada. So always ignore these ratios and never make recommendations for fertilizer for potassium, calcium, magnesium based on ratios. When it comes to cation exchange capacity and base saturation, like I said, You don't need to be testing this every year. Once you tested for it, you don't need to really test for it again. But that doesn't change appreciably from year to year. But there are times where I will use this kind of information. For example, I would use it to diagnose a sodic soil. I would look at the percent of sodium on exchange complex. And if it's more than 12%, then I'm going to be very concerned, and I would use that to diagnose it as a sodic soil. So there are times where I will use this, but I would not normally use it for making fertilizer recommendations. Now, as I mentioned, typically at the bottom of a soil test report, the lab will give you recommendations. We have 2 soil testing labs in Alberta, Element Labs in Edmonton and Down to Earth Labs in Lethbridge. They're the only 2 labs. Used to have about 6, but now we only have 2 labs, and they both use the recommended analytical measurements that are recommended by Alberta Agriculture. We don't have a lab in Saskatchewan anymore, and BioTest is closed. There's only one lab in Manitoba, and that's the Farmer's Edge Lab. So if you're not using an Alberta lab, then your samples are sent away, they'll probably go to the States or to an Eastern Canada lab. And so then you'd really want to question the recommendations you get, where are those recommendations coming from. The Alberta labs are not bad, but really in my mind, I look at this as a job of the farmer working with your agronomist or your fertilizer dealer to look at the recommendations the lab has and then fine tune your fertilizer recommendations for your farm. And there's various philosophies that different people have, and none of them are absolutely right or absolutely wrong. For example, for sufficiency level philosophy, I would tend to use that for nitrogen. I want to put on enough nitrogen to correct that nutrient deficiency. And our soil, many of our cultivated soils, the vast majority of them are going to be nitrogen deficient going into most springs, unless you're growing a legume crop or pulse crop. Sometimes the replacement, for example, for potassium, if your levels are quite nearing kind of the marginal level, you might want to put on enough potassium each year to replace what the crop is removing to maintain a good level. Or you might want to use a build and maintain philosophy. For example, with phosphorus, about 80% of our soils across Alberta have limited phosphorus levels. So you might want to be putting on a little bit more phosphorus than what the crop actually requires. So it's above crop removal to try to build your phosphorus levels somewhat to maintain a good phosphorus level. So there are different philosophies, and you might tend to use different philosophies for different nutrients depending on your situation. Now, I will mention that in Alberta, we have developed a program called AFFIRM to make fertilizer recommendation rates. And so AFFIRM actually stands for Alberta Farm Fertilizer Information Recommendation Manager. And that program was actually developed by Len Krasnowski and his co-workers. They worked with him very closely for many years. He basically took most of the fertilizer research that was done across Alberta for many years and put it into one computer program to make where farmers could use this program to help them develop fertilizer recommendations. So it allows you to input the soil test levels for each field, then you list the crop you plan to grow, what your soil moisture levels are like, and you also indicate what soil zone you're in, so it has that information. You can also input fertilizer prices, and then based on the fertilizer research we've done over many years across Alberta, it will help you develop your fertilizer recommendations economically. And this program is free and can be downloaded from the Alberta Agriculture website. If you just type in AFFIRM on the Alberta Agriculture website, then you can find it and download it. But the bad news is that Alberta Agriculture used to be in the business of doing fertilizer research across the province. We did a very good job of doing coordinated province-wide fertilizer research. That's basically started to wind down about 10 years ago. The last of the staff were laid off 3 years ago, so that work is not done anymore. Other organizations have not picked that ball up. So we have no coordinated effort to do research across the province anymore. So this program doesn't have any way of being updated. Len Krasnowski and his staff were laid off just after this program was released, the most recent update. So as the time goes by, this program will be older and become more dated, but then we don't have any new research being done to keep it up to date, and we don't have staff to do it. So that is my greatest concern for farmers down the road, is getting good access to good, reliable fertilizer research information to help you maintain fertilizing wisely and accurately. Now, how to develop nitrogen fertilizer recommendations. One of the ways you want to start is, if you're going to do it by yourself and actually not use that program, is actually the first thing you want to do is kind of develop what are the reasonable target yields for each crop in each of your fields. So you want to look at the field history. How did that field perform in the past? but in each spring also assess what is your soil moisture going like in the spring. In many areas in southern Alberta, for example, soil moisture levels are very, very low. Even with normal growing season precipitation, we're going to have lower yield expectations. So your target yields have to be reasonable based on the moisture situation we have going into spring. And so for each crop, you want to estimate what your target yield would be, and then determine how much nitrogen is going to be needed for that target yield. And what are the sources of the nitrogen that are going to come from that field? Well, that's why I really encourage soil testing. That'll tell you how much nitrogen you have to 24 inches. But you also have to keep in mind, if you have a healthy soil with good organic matter levels, it's always going to be mineralizing nitrogen. And so a brown soil might be mineralizing up to 20 pounds or 25 pounds of nitrogen during the growing season. A black soil may be up as much as 80 pounds of nitrogen. So we want to take that factor into consideration. What about biological N fixation? Did you grow legumes or pulse crops in any of your fields the previous year? Because that can contribute another 20 to 50 pounds of nitrogen, depending on the residue that was left behind from the previous year. And then what about livestock manure? Livestock manure is extremely valuable in terms of providing not just nitrogen, but many other nutrients that plants require. So what will be the contribution of nitrogen from livestock manure if it was applied 1 or 2 or 3 years ago? So you want to keep those in mind. So you need to kind of, first of all, decide what's the total nitrogen requirement for your crop based on the target yields you've developed. How much nitrogen can the soil provide in each of your fields based on cropping history and manure history. And then you have to decide how much nitrogen must be put on using commercial fertilizer, if any is needed. So let's just say, all this first, let's just say our target yield, say you have a target yield for 60 bushels of wheat this coming year. We'd want to do a simple calculation. So the 60 bushel an acre wheat crop is going to need about 120 pounds of nitrogen. And let's do a soil test, and we say it's 20 pounds of nitrogen, sorry, 30 pounds of nitrogen. Nitrogen is available. So how much fertilizer we would need? Total crop and need is 120 pounds minus the soil nitrate level, which is 30 pounds. That means, well, we need 90 pounds of nitrogen. That's a very simplistic way of doing it. You can do it that way, but it doesn't consider nitrogen mineralization or any contribution from pulse crops or manure. And it also doesn't consider when you do put on a commercial fertilizer, it's not taken up with 100% efficiency. Typically, it's more in the range of 60 to 65% efficiency. So we have to keep that in mind. So I would suggest maybe doing a more detailed calculation. So let's just start off again. 60 bushel wheat crop needs 120 pounds of nitrogen. And we've said we had 30 pounds of nitrogen in a soil test, but then we want to do an estimate of what is the mineralization of this soil. Let's say is in the thin black soil zone, we estimate it's going to have about 40 pounds of nitrogen will be released from the organic matter. And if you want, we talk about this afterwards, but I can even suggest to you how you can actually determine that using check strips in your field over a period of years to how to actually estimate soil and mineralization. So that would basically say 30 plus 40 is 70 pounds of nitrogen per acre will be provided by the soil in this particular case. So 120 pounds of nitrogen needed. Subtract 70 that's going to come to soil at 50 pounds of nitrogen. But I also mentioned that plants don't take up fertilizer with 100% efficiency. It's more like about 60 to 65%. So keeping that in mind, that would really mean we should be putting on about 80 to 85 pounds of nitrogen based on these conditions in the soil zone to hit that 60 bushel wheat target. So now let's move to phosphorus and think about how to put on phosphorus. Before I retired, I actually updated most of the AgDex publications that are on the Alberta Agriculture website. This one is phosphorus fertilizer application and crop production. And I'd really encourage you to just go and download that. I updated it in 2013, so it's 10 years old, but there really hasn't been much new phosphorus research to really update this. So it's about as up to date as you're going to get. And so basically, it says that if your soil test is low in a range of 0 to 15 pounds of actual phosphorus, you'd have a very high probability of crop response. We consider that to be very low, or if you're in that range of 15 to 30, again, I call that low, a high probability of response to phosphorus. Now, I should mention that in Alberta, we did a lot of work back in the 90s. We looked at a number of different soil tests. We found that the modified Kelowna method, was by far the best to predict phosphorus response. We looked at a number of different methods, and it was the best. And in fact, that's the recommended method by Alberta Agriculture. That's the method if you send samples away for analysis, that's the method the lab should be using. And both the Alberta labs, Down to Earth labs and Element labs use that method. If you send your samples to Farmers Edge in Winnipeg, that's the method they will use for Alberta. There are labs in BC, and they actually use the Kelowna method. And the Kelowna method is the recommended method in BC, and the modified Kelowna method is the recommended method in Alberta and Saskatchewan. However, if you have your sample sent to Ontario, odds are they will use the Olsen method and the Bray method. And we did calibrate for the Olsen method. It's not as good as the Kelowna method, but it's only suitable for high pH soil. That extraction solution is buffered to a pH of 8. If you use that extraction solution on an acid soil, you're not going to pull anything out, so it's a waste of time. And the Bray method is designed for acid soils. We never calibrated to Alberta soils even back in the 90s because they knew it wouldn't work suitably across a wide range of soils and soil pHs. But the modified Kelowna does. So whenever you send samples, or your agronomist is sending samples away for analysis, make sure they use the modified Kelowna method. If they're using these methods, you're not wasting your money, but you're not getting the best you're not going to get the best recommendations for phosphorus fertilizer. So let's just, I'm just going to back up for a second. Oops. I was just kind of jumping the gun. This is actually an Element Labs soil test report. You can see here, phosphorus is tests at 7 parts per million, multiplying it by 2. They came actually with 13 pounds per acre. So basically that would say that's very low with a high probability of response. Now, if you go to that AgDex publication I just mentioned, go to table 8, this is actually for spring wheat. For medium textured soils with a neutral pH, let's assume that we're on a black soil, and this is the range where our soil test is coming in. It was actually 12 or 13, so we're in this range here. We would actually, so the table will tell you, well, in a year with good moisture, we'd recommend 40 pounds of phosphate seed placed with wheat. If it's a bit on the drier side, you might want to cut that back to 30 to 35. If moisture conditions are very good in the spring, you might even want to bump that up to 45, and that's what our research is showing. Then the next table, table 9, if we go to it, this gives you the probability of getting greater than 2 bushels an acre or greater than 5 bushels per acre based on the research that we did over hundreds of sites across Alberta. So again, let's look at the thin black soil zone, greater than 2 bushels and greater than 5 bushels. What's the probability at this particular soil test? Well, we follow the fertilizer recommendations. Odds are, based on all of the field trials we did, 95% of our sites gave us at least 2 bushels or more of yield increase. At 80% of our sites, we had 5 bushels or more yield increase with that phosphate fertilizer. So at least it gives you probabilities of what are the odds of getting a good yield increase. And so that's the other advantage of using the modified Kelowna method and our research to decide how much phosphate fertilizer to put on. And then the AgDex publication has a lot of other good advice in there. It just reminds us that phosphorus is a very immobile and nutrient in soil. It's most effective when soil test levels are low to very low. A placement with a seed can provide a bit of a start or a pop effect. And often we tend in direct seed systems or seeding into cooler, wetter soils. And then that pop-up effect or responsive phosphate becomes even more important. Seed placement at phosphorus is most effective. However, when we're in drier conditions, sometimes putting that phosphorus off in a sideband versus with a seed is actually sometimes a wise idea. About 75% of the time, our best response is with seed placed, while 25% of our time, our best response is with sideband. And you're not going to go wrong using either one. But in drier years, when soil moisture is a bit more limiting, sometimes putting that fertilizer a little deeper is a little bit more beneficial. And then always keep in mind what our safe rates, for example, with canola, never put more than about 15 pounds of phosphate seed placed, or with peas, maybe 20 to 25 would be the maximum. So always keep in mind what's the maximum put with the seed safely as well. Now, the next nutrient we'll talk about is potassium. Typically we talk about K2O, but the actual fertilizer we put on is a KCl, potassium chloride, which is 0060. This is the the AgDex publication I'd encourage you to download from the Alberta Agriculture website. Again, I updated it in 2013, so it's 10 years old, but really there hasn't been much of any work done in the last 10 years to update this publication. So the information is about as up to date as you're going to get. Basically, if your soil test levels are above 300 in the top 0 to 6 inch depth, then you're adequate. You don't really need to use potassium really for any of the annual crops we grow. But as we drop below 250 in terms of pounds per acre for potassium in the soil test, then the soils are more and more deficient, and more important that we actually put potassium fertilizer on. And if we're between 250 and 300, I consider that you might want to be put on a maintenance application. Even though we're sort of above that critical level of 250 pounds an acre, it might be wise to be looking at a maintenance or building application. Now, in this particular case, potassium was at 405, and if your soil test level is above 300, like I said, you don't need it. So in this particular case, it's optimum. You don't have to worry about putting potassium on. And I thought I'd just show you, sometimes it's nice just to think about what of all the research we did, what was the story that the research really told us. This looks at all of the barley work done across the province for many years. That when we had a soil test level for potassium of less than 50 pounds per acre, every site in Alberta responded to potassium fertilizer. When soil test levels were between 50 and 100, 75% of all of our research sites responded to potassium fertilizer. And you can see as the soil test level increased, the percentage of sites actually decreased. And when the soil test level was between 200 and 250, not quite 20% of our sites responded. That means almost 80% of our sites did not respond. And that's really why we have 250 that are cut off. 3% of our sites did respond to potassium when we're above 250. So between 250 and 300, that's why I suggest a maintenance application. But once you're over 300, it's almost a waste of time. But it's always nice to look at the research data to help you understand kind of what is going on and how the recommendations are actually developed. So from that particular AgDex publication, if you go to this particular table, this is for cereal crops. This is for the thin black soil zone. Let's just say your soil test is between 100 and 150 pounds of K. Then we would actually recommend 45 to 60 pounds. If it's closer to 100, put on a bit more. If it's close to 150, maybe put on a little less. But that would be what we'd actually recommend. So use these tables to help you make your decision. And as I mentioned, between 250 and 300, putting on a maintenance application or even what the crop would replace would be maybe a wise thing to do. But once you're over 300, probably no need. But oftentimes you'll see agronomists recommend potassium above that level, but do we really need it? So you want to look back at what has the research said over the years? And generally the research said we don't need it. Just a couple of comments about potassium. Potassium is much like phosphorus, has very limited movement in soil. Ideally, we want to put it as close to the seed as possible, but we have to keep in mind that KCl is very salty, it has a high salt index. So usually I suggest put phosphate with the seed as much as you can. And then for potassium, put in a side band or a mid-row band away from the seed. If it gets too much with the seed, that's going to affect germination and then emergence. It will decrease emergence, which is not good. So that's a concern. For sulfur, this is the sulfur AgDex that I wrote and updated, but it actually needs to be updated. And I suggested that to the department, and I'd even do it for free if they want, but they don't seem to be very interested in keeping good information for farmers these days. They're worried about other things like I won't even talk about it. So we'll talk about sources of sulfur in the soil. So one of the reasons why I like to soil sample 0 to 6, 6 to 12, and 12 to 24, it's not uncommon, especially after a wetter year. Our 0 to 6 inch depth might be quite low in sulfur, but it's not uncommon at deeper depths, particularly in the subsoil, we have the presence of gypsum salts, that's calcium sulfate, which is available to plants. And so we might find that we don't have very much here, but we have lots here. But will the roots get down here in time? They may not. So if this is deficient, we will probably want to be put on some sulfur. And so we're looking at depth sampling is very important. And this is the table I'd maybe suggest you look at, not the one in the AgDex publication is good, but we did more with a fellow who replaced me. We did more sulfur work, and I'd like to see that publication updated. But this is an example. if your 0 to 6 inch depth is testing between 5 and 10 pounds, and but your total depth is between 0 and 24 inch depth, if add all those depths together is 30 to 40, well, I would say, well, you're adequate. But in fact, the surface soil is low. So you probably want to be putting on some sulfur, even though that the total soil has lots of sulfur, the surface soil doesn't. So you maybe want to be putting on a little bit of sulfur fertilizer, 10 or 15 pounds per wheat, for example, just to ensure you have enough to get the crop off to a good start. And then once the crop is well established, then it will tap into that sulfur at depth. In terms of micronutrients, we do have copper deficiencies with cereal crops in the black, gray, and dark gray soils in central Alberta and northern Alberta. We have seen zinc deficiencies with irrigated crops, particularly on sandier soils with crops like beans and a few other special crops. There's been a lot of concern with boron and canola. We've seen a lot of boron recommended on canola, but the research has shown across the province that it's very rarely needed. And that's the problem with our soil test. It doesn't work. So there's boron there. The soil test just doesn't seem to identify. Certainly more work needs to be done on that. But I'd certainly encourage you to have a look at the micronutrient fact sheet that I wrote and for more reading. But when it comes to copper, that'd be the one I'd be the most concerned about. In the brown and dark brown soil zone, our work is showing as long as you're above 0.3 parts per million, you're fine. If you are in the thin black, gray soils, if you are below 0.5 for copper, you definitely should be putting it on. And we haven't talked at all about organic soils or peaty soils like the musky type soils that you'd run into in north central and northern Alberta, but they are very responsive to copper. And so if your soil test levels are less than 2.5 parts per million, we'd be recommending copper. And just as a reminder, don't put any faith in the boron soil test or putting it on boron. Kind of watch your zinc. It's very rare we need zinc, but there's the occasional time we do see it. And the more we crop our soils, we're going to start to see more micronutrient deficiencies down the road. But if you do have a recommendation or a soil test that shows you deficient, or you get a recommendation from agronomist, always seek a couple of unbiased opinions, expert opinions, just to get some other opinions, just to make sure you're doing the right thing. And you might even want to use micronutrients on a trial basis in test strips first. And even today, I noticed some advertising for some micronutrients to boost yields of wheat by 2.6 bushels, not two bushels or 3 bushels, but 2.6 bushels. And I looked at that and I just almost laughed out loud. Anyway, there's all kinds of good publications on the Alberta Agriculture website. Some of them I wrote that have been since taken down, but there's still lots of good information there. So just to kind of wrap up the talk, and I'm going a little bit over my hour, but there's all kinds of factors that influence crop yield. There's the various environmental and weather-related issues. There's a lot of the seeding issues and crop establishment issues that are within, or at least mostly within the control of the farmer. And then there's all these other soil factors here. Unfortunately, we can't quite see them all. But soil type, soil organic matter, soil texture, aggregate size, infiltration rate, soil pH topography. There's a lot of different things that you want to sort of look at and think, how are these affecting my yield? And are there things that I might be able to do to improve my soil quality and my soil health? I just thought I would just point out Alberta Agriculture does have on their website something called Alberta Soil Quality Card. I wasn't involved in developing it, but it does have some interesting things here, indicators you can rate. And if I was doing it, there was actually quite a few other things that I'd actually add to it. But these are just some of the things that I want you to think about. So soil tests to determine nutrient levels, to help you decide what you need in the way of fertilizers. You can look at your soil properties like soil texture, pH, salinity. Are these in reasonable? Are these in good shape on your farm? Or are there things you're worried about? Are you interested in building soil organic matter? Are there any concerns with base saturation or cation exchange capacity? You really can't change your cation exchange capacity unless you're increasing organic matter. That will increase the cation exchange capacity a wee bit, but not much. Then there's lots of other things. What about the residue cover on your soil, the slope position, infiltration rate, water holding capacity, bulk density, porosity, soil compaction, soil structure, and aggregate size, soil crusting, erosion. And there's various biological indicators that people are starting to have a look at, like soil respiration, microorganism population, or look at the enzymes in the soil that are released by microbes or plant roots, like phosphatase and things like that. There's various things we can start looking at and exploring. In some ways, I wish I was, 30 years younger so I could still be doing this kind of work. But unfortunately, I'm an old white-haired guy, and it's kind of past my due date. So, but anyway, what I'd like to do is just to encourage you to be looking at all the different factors on your farm, and where there's issues of concern, maybe do more info and more investigation on your own, do more reading. Consider hiring an agronomist or soil expert to maybe assist or advise you. And then from there, start looking at your soil management and your crop management. And what are some of the slight or moderate changes you might want to look at your management, so you can gradually start looking at ways of improving your soil quality and soil health. So I've really gone through this very quickly in just over an hour. So hopefully you found this beneficial. And I've kind of been reluctant giving out my phone number and email address lately, but I do have a Twitter account, and that's the username. So if you ever have any questions, feel free to just direct message me on Twitter, and I'll get back to you if you give me a name or your name and your phone number or email address. I can try to get back to you, or maybe email your questions to Adrian, and she can pass them on to me, and we can chat further. So that's probably more than enough, and so maybe I'll turn it back to Adrian if there's any questions.
Wow, Dr. McKenzie, that was a fantastic presentation.
I want to make sure you got your money's worth, so I tried to give you as much dirt as I possibly could.
We definitely got more than our money's worth, Ross. That was fantastic. Thank you very much. We do have some questions. I will read them out, and a reminder to folks, if you have questions for Dr. McKenzie, to put them in the Q&A. So we have, our first question is do you have any insight to soil composition around natural springs like artesian wells? We have a pasture around an artesian well that just doesn't produce.
Well, probably what I would suggest is if you have a artesian well and things aren't growing very well, I would suggest soil sampling to see what the cause is. It could very well be just increased salt levels, and it's not uncommon for wells to have naturally high levels of salts in them, so you have a salinity problem. But also, it's not uncommon for artesian wells to be higher in sodium, which would then cause the soil to be sodic when it would cause a very high pH. So, but you really need a soil test to determine if your soils are saline or sodic, or in some cases they might be saline and sodic, which would be a bit complex to try to correct. But that's the first place I will go, is the soil sample, see what the actual issues are that are causing the poor growth, and then go from there in terms of management. And for salinity and for sodicity, there are certain things you can use. For example, for sodic soils, you can put on a product called gypsum to try to displace that calcium out of that soil. But it takes very careful management to do it. Or for salinity, if you can somehow improve the subsurface drainage, either with vegetation or with tile drainage, there's certain things you can do. But a lot of it will come down to cost. Would it even be economic? So we're probably just trying to manage it, figure out what the problem is, and then looking at what can you do from a biological standpoint with our permanent crops to try to undertake some reclamation.
Perfect. We have another question. What solutions have you come across to battle high salinity of the soils in southern Alberta, including having bentonite soil with the complexity of wind erosion and heat to assist with germination of seed in rangeland without a pivot?
Well, when you have salinity, that is a real tough one. Typically, when you have dryland salinity, you typically also have a high water table. And so the first question is, and actually, again, this is where you're going to think I'm really kind of bad mouthing Alberta culture, but we used to have the Dryland Salinity Control Association, a group of farmers and a team of people in Lethbridge, soil salinity specialists who would actually work with farmers and do drilling, figure out where the water tables were, whether recharge and discharge areas were, how saline they were, and then with cropping, figure out where's that water coming from, where's that recharge area, and try to crop those areas to prevent that excess water from moving down to the water table and in the discharge areas where that's causing the problem. And that's a long-term um, issue, but it's certainly very possible. But what I would suggest is maybe talking to a good agronomist who is very well informed. There's a fellow I know that in Warner that's not bad, Jack Payne, who works with co-op. He used to work for Alberta Culture doing dryland salinity control work. So tap into somebody like that, maybe work with you to try and identify the recharge and discharge areas. How salty is it? And then what sort of cultural controls could you use to try to reclaim those areas? You can use tile subsurface drainage to reclaim them. They worked very well. I even did design work years ago with tile drainage, but I'm not a fan because I don't like taking those salts that in the soil and then putting a tile drain in and putting them back into the surface waters and polluting them. So I much prefer cultural controls to tile drainage, but tile drainage is an option, but cultural controls is the way I would look at it first. But you need to work with an agronomist and do some further investigation. That would be my suggestion.
That's excellent advice, Ross. Another question for you. When sampling two depths, shall one always assume the lower depth is a higher pH?
Yeah. The odds are almost most of the time it will be just the way our soils have formed and developed. Typically, our soils were all relatively calcareous, and then over time, those carbonates have leached down into the sea horizon or the subsoil. So almost always that subsoil will have a higher pH than the surface soil. Now, not always, because with fertilizer use, um, we've seen some things going on that are causing changes, but typically, the way our soils are formed and developed almost always our subsoils have a higher pH than the surface soil.
Another question for you. When growing crops in the western areas of southern Alberta versus more towards the Lethbridge Picture Butte, the OM or organic matter varies greatly, as well as the nutrient capacity. What are the best ways to optimize nutrient uptake in the soils, especially on a dry year? I realize manure is great, but what are the other options if we are already trying to apply manure every few years? This would be for irrigated land, but with limited water availability in the upcoming drought year.
I'd almost want to talk to this guy one-on-one or woman one-on-one just to get more detail because it's a very broad general question. The soils in the Lethbridge area in a dark brown soil zone. And then as we start to shift west towards Pincher Creek is in the thin black soil zone. Same with Clarkson is in the thin black soil zone. So higher organic matter levels. But there are areas, like for example, there's an area we call the Summerview area north of Brockett. It should really be a higher organic matter, but just because of the microclimate there, it's relatively dry and they're almost more dark brown soils, lower organic matter. So there's depending on the microclimate you have, um, they might have lower organic matter even around Lethbridge. But assuming that they have access to manure and they manure once every 4 years, really what I would suggest is then soil test and see what your nutrient levels are. Odds are um, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur. If you're manuring every 4 years, your phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur levels are going to be adequate. So the only nutrient you probably should have to worry about is nitrogen. And the year after you apply the manure, especially in a dry year, you probably don't even. If you look at what's in the soil from a soil test and then look at how much manure was put on the previous year, if it was say 30 tons per acre, that's going to give you a fair amount of mineralization on organic matter. So in the year after manure application, you probably don't even need to put on any, especially if we're going to have we're going into a drier spring and the water from an irrigation standpoint is limited. But in say the third or fourth year after manure was put on, definitely they would be having to put on some nitrogen and then be thinking about what is your target yield and then fertilize it according to that target yield based on your moisture conditions and that sort of thing. But I'd be looking at sort of your target yield, what is going to come from the soil, what's going to come from manure, and then from there, um, decide how much fertilizer to put on. And if that fellow would or person would like to chat with me more, they can maybe just put them in contact with me. That's a bit of a vague answer, but it's kind of hard to know without knowing much more detail.
That's fair, Dr. McKenzie. Another question for you. How does prolonged drought affect nutrients in the soil? Does the micronutrient profile or depth change with prolonged drought conditions?
Thing about drought is that that means we have very limited water. And so if we have limited water, those nutrients aren't going to move anywhere in the soil, whether regardless that they're mobile or not. And if we have limited water, that also is going to limit plant growth and nutrient uptake from the soil. So typically when you have a dry year or several dry years, we're not going to really see much change in that nutrient profile. You might have some of those nutrients might shift from, like say for potassium can occur in, it'll be available, exchangeable, and fairly well held. And I think you might get some movement from available to get kind of shifting to exchangeable. You might get some shifting, but you're not going to lose anything. And so I really wouldn't be too concerned about nutrient loss or micronutrient tie-up or anything like that. Um, and so there's not much you can do. And sadly, most people don't really pay that close attention. But really, in southern Alberta, in the last 10 years, we've only had 1 year where we've had above normal growing season precipitation, and 1 year with normal growing season precipitation where the moisture was normally distributed. The rest of the years, we've had periods of drought, and then we've actually had 6 years total in the last 8 years that have been that I would actually consider drought. So it's probably a little more serious than what a lot of people really making out to be.
Absolutely. Another question for you. How often have you seen any boron, copper, or zinc deficiencies in soils in Alberta?
With zinc deficiencies, um, most of those responses have been limited to very sandy soils under irrigation, particularly irrigated dry beans. That's the most sensitive. In a cool, wet spring, zinc is less available. And so then we've seen it in zinc deficiency in irrigated dry beans, and occasionally on grain corn or silage corn, but not often. But those would be the two crops I'd be most concerned about. And only on sandy soils. We don't see it in fields close by that are loam or clay loam. We don't see deficiency. That's only in the sandy soils where we see the zinc deficiency. And we did a lot of variable rate fertilizer work, particularly in southern Alberta, but in central Alberta, we looked very closely at zinc, and we didn't see any responses even on hilltops even when the soil test was down at 0.5 parts per million for zinc. For copper, I'm a lot more concerned. Um, Generally, we don't see copper deficiency in southern Alberta, but once you get up into thin black and the black soils, and then into dark gray and the gray soils, we do see zinc deficiency, but almost always it's on sandier soils that are lower in organic matter. And sometimes may have a history of having a bit more phosphate fertilizer as well. So, um, so soils in those in the black, gray, and the dark gray that are sandy, those would be the places I really be looking for copper deficiency. And if your soil test is less than a half a part per million, the research has been very clear that work done by Westco and by Alberta Agriculture is very clear that once you're less than 0.5 parts per million, it's time to be using copper. For boron, a lot of work. I did a lot of work. Regis Karamanis with Westco did a lot of work. Mario Hartman, when he was with Alberta Ag, out of Lacombe, did a lot of work with boron. And we very rarely ever saw responses to boron across Alberta, but probably about a third of our soils test low or typically deficient in boron. But in fact, it's the soil test that's a problem. And then people are making recommendations for boron based on a soil test that's not accurate. And so my suggestion is if you are on a very sandy soil, there's a greater probability you might have boron deficiency with canola. But I would not recommend boron strictly on a soil test in Alberta.
Perfect. I'm going to combine the next two questions. They're wondering if a firm would be applicable for use um, in the BC Peace region, and how does a firm compare to tools like the Western Ag Crop Caster? And maybe Ross, you could
Um,
tell us what a firm is.
Affirmed, as I mentioned, it stands for the Alberta Farm Fertilizer Information Recommendation Manager. It's a program developed by Alberta Agriculture staff based on Alberta criteria across the province. Now, what is if if they're in BC and they wanted to use it, they would have to select the Peace River soils, but they'd have to probably put in a land location that would be for Alberta. kind of override that, but then utilize those recommendations or in a firm to develop their recommendations. I just find some areas that are similar to you in the Peace River region, use those land locations, and then override the land location to actually utilize a program. But there's no reason why they couldn't do that. I know farmers in Saskatchewan do that as well. They just override it with using an Alberta land location.
Okay, and how does it compare to tools like Western Ag Cropcaster?
I haven't actually used the Western ag cropcaster, so I really couldn't comment on how that would compare. I'm not even sure who developed that program just offhand. I've heard of it, and I can't remember who developed it.
I have another question for you, Ross. We have lots of questions for you. Um, what were the two testing labs in Alberta? What would a cost be for soil sampling? And is it recommended to test yearly?
The two labs are Envirotest was the old lab in Saskatchewan. The two labs are Element Labs in Edmonton and Down to Earth Labs in Lethbridge, and both are good labs. Both use the recommended analytical procedures recommended by Alberta Agriculture. Um, in terms of the cost, I really haven't kept up in terms of what the cost is. The basic soil analysis, for one depth for just the basic nutrients NPKs is probably around $35 or $40. I'm guessing because I haven't done it for a while. I uh, I know my brother-in-law just sent me a bunch of soil tests to go through a couple of weeks ago, or about a week ago. They came from Down to Earth Lab, so I look at them all the time, but I never pay for them. So I'm not quite sure what the costs are, but in my mind, very reasonable. And in his particular case, they have about 40 quarters, and and they're also manured, and they soil sample and analyze every year, and that's what I'd recommend. But you don't have to be testing for everything every year. Really, what I would suggest, test for N, P, K, and S, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur. That's really all you need to test for. These organic matter and pH and salt levels, they're not going to change much from year to year. It doesn't cost much to have that analyzed, and usually that's included in the analysis. But to this testing for those four basic nutrients and the basics for pH, EC, and S, organic matter, there's no reason why I can't do that. But I wouldn't worry about testing for base saturation or cation exchange capacity or all the micronutrients. If you test once and they're good, I wouldn't worry about testing for that again for another 5 years.
Would you have a recommendation on how often to test for organic matter? Once every 10 years?
Well, to be honest, in our we ran some long-term trials for 28 years at Bow Island, but we only tested the organic matter. Basically, we're testing for the carbon. We only did that once every 6 years, depending on what our crop rotations were, because organic matter changes so slowly that you don't really have to test. You're not going to really see much difference in 2 or 3 years. So really, we felt we did it every 6 years. We had some 3 year and 6 year rotations. So we just tested it once every 6 years. But if you test once every 5 years, that's lots. And we were very precise the way we do our sampling because we were actually taking into account soil bulk density. We were being very precise in our sampling where for the analysis that is done typically for organic matter, it's much more crude. So doing it once every 5 years is plenty.
Perfect. That was my question. The next one we have for you, Ross. Do you think the recommended rates for macronutrients might be higher with newer varieties that might have higher yield potential than 10 years ago?
Definitely. And that's one of the reasons why I'm critical of Alberta culture, laying off all of the staff that did that kind of work. We had a good team of about 5 people who worked across the province doing fertilizer research, and we were very coordinated doing trials. Like, for example, when we did our phosphorus work, we were having up to 150 trials each summer across the province on different soil zones with wheat and barley and canola to develop our fertilizer recommendations. But we've lost that ability. We have applied research associations that do work, but they don't work well together, it seems, and they're not doing coordinated fertilizer trials across the province. They're not taking their information and gathering together, providing to soil testing labs with recommendations that we used to do. So the bottom line is the varieties that we're growing now are going to yield a little bit better and going to need a little bit more nutrients now than they did 10 years ago. And in 10 years from now, they're going to need more because with continued plant breeding and as we're improving our cropping practices and crop rotations and moisture management, those yields are going to be higher. And as we increase our yield, we're going to increase our nutrient requirements, but we're not taking that into account in terms of having the labs and agronomists have up-to-date information to make those recommendations. So that is a fundamental mistake. The biggest mistake Alberta agriculture ever did was laying off its research staff.
Thanks.
That was my little short rant for tonight. I'll shut up. No more rants tonight.
You're good. You're good. Another question for you. Do you have any thoughts on using gypsum on solonetzik soils to attempt to remediate the soil and increase production on irrigated land?
Certainly, the problem with sodic soils or solonetzik soils is that B horizon has a concentration of sodium, and usually that sodium will be up around 12 or 14 or 16% on exchange complex. It should be less than 1%. And so somehow you have to kick that sodium off of the exchange complex. And the best way to do that is apply something that can do that. And the best product is gypsum. That's calcium sulfate. And but then you have to figure out how much to put on. So then you need to know the cation exchange capacity, and there's certain other factors you need to know to do that calculation. And if you go to the Alberta Agriculture website, there's a fact sheet that Dr. Shelley Woods and I wrote on managing sodic soils, and that explains the process you have to go through, the analysis you need, and the procedure you have to go through to calculate how much gypsum you'll actually have to apply to reclaim that soil. But it certainly is very possible to improve the soils. And if it was on dryland soils, I probably suggest it's not really worth the effort because you need good moisture conditions for that exchange process to take place. And so under irrigated conditions, and certainly there are solonetzik soils in that Vauxhall, particularly up in the Brooks area and north of Brooks, there are lots of solonetzik soils that are irrigated that could potentially benefit from gypsum application.
Perfect. Thank you, Ross. Another question for you. Nitrogen calculations are only for Alberta, or is it used around Canada?
Well, they're used around the world, actually. So really what you want to do is look at your yield potential, your sources of nitrogen that would come from the soil, your fertilizer efficiencies, and then calculate. I actually much prefer to use fertilizer response curves, like developing nitrogen fertilizer response curves, because then mineralization and that sort of thing and fertilizer efficiencies are all kind of built in. So I much prefer using nitrogen fertilizer response curves have been calibrated to specific soils because they're much more accurate than doing the calculation method. But as time goes by, we're not doing much soil test correlation work in Alberta anymore. So we're going to be faced with having to do the calculation method. So that's why I recommended using the firm method because it has all of our calibration curves in there, but they're getting older and older. Actually, the nitrogen curves are from a lot of the work we did between about 2008 and 2012 before I retired. So that work is already 10 years old. And so that's the downside. So we're going to have to be looking at doing more and more calculating to decide what to put on.
Makes sense. Another question. Can phosphorus be reduced with soil biology like a tea extract? Or is it more of a myth?
I'm not sure what they mean by that.
It says, yeah, it says tea extracts from Johnson Sioux. So I don't know if it's eco tea. If that's
I've heard of the eco teas and things like that to stimulate microbial populations, things like that. I'm a little bit cool on that, but in terms of tea extracts and any impact on soil phosphorus availability, I suspect it wouldn't have much impact on soil phosphorus availability, and that's sort of that's my sense based on the question, but I'm probably not quite clear on what they're asking.
okay, that's perfect. I have another comment question. I spread ag lime last fall, then lightly dissed it. Should I have any concerns about mid-rowing ammonium sulfate this spring?
So how much did they say how much ag lime you put on? Like,
No, they
it,
did.
it,
And if they're still listening, they could pop back on and tell us how much they put on.
because some people might just put on a couple 100 pounds, but often if you're going to really influence pH, often you have to be looking at 1 or 2 tons. But regardless, and to be honest, the first thing I would say, if you did put it on and just dist it in lightly, to really have an effect on soil pH, you really have to, use a disc and work it in well, and then over time, then that ag line will work with the soil to gradually increase the soil pH. But if you just leave it on mostly on the soil surface, it's not going to really have much of an impact down at 3 or 4 inches. But if you just broadcast very lightly and you're going to mid-row band his ammonium sulfate, it's well away from the seed, that really shouldn't be a problem at all.
There's all sorts of new fertilizer and nutrient products coming out, and it's hard to sort out the effectiveness of them. To help advise producers, does Dr. McKenzie have any advice to help filter through all of the volumes of product out there?
Wish I had some really good advice. The biggest problem is that there's nobody left in Alberta culture to do fertilizer research, and there's also no extension staff. We used to have people at the Ag Info Center at Stettler that were very good at answering questions and really kept very good touch with the researchers. But we don't have extension staff within Alberta culture to talk about it and to stay up to date, and we don't have researchers. And even with Ag Canada, they don't really have anybody that I'm aware of that is doing fertilizer research at Lacombe or Lethbridge. So really, um, that means you have to go to maybe somebody in some of the applied research associations for advice. And I don't really, you know, they've changed a lot in the last 10 years. So I'm not really that familiar with who's working with a different applied research association. If you do have an applied research association in your area and they have an agronomist there that's doing some testing of some of these new products, maybe talk to them. Some of the applied research associations are doing work with new products, but you have to remember their association to get the results. So then that kind of hoops you as well. Don Flayton, who used to be at the University of Manitoba, he just recently retired, but he was excellent. He's retired now. Um, Jeff Shuno at the University of Saskatchewan still does very good fertilizer research. Matter of fact, he's really the only person left in Western Canada with Rigas Karamanis, Cindy Grant, Don Flayton. They were some of the key people who did a lot of the fertilizer testing, were very knowledgeable. Jeff is the only person really left in Western Canada that's very knowledgeable. You could always try calling him, but he's one man and he's swamped, so it's hard to get a hold of him. The other thing is to talk to your fertilizer dealers, but I always have a concern about somebody who's selling products and not always completely unbiased. Some agronomists are keep up to date on some of these products, but the bottom line is that there's lots of new products coming out there, and they're under the Fertilizer Act. They don't have to prove that they work, and they used to have to have the information to prove they work before they could be registered. That changed about 10 or 15 years ago, and so the Fertilizer Act, in my opinion, is useless. People can sell whatever they want. During the presentation, I made a comment about a company that sells micronutrients, how you would increase your yield by 2 point some bushels if you use their product, and that's a joke. And I guess all I can do is to simply say that first, we'll use critical thinking. What are the claims that they're making? Does it sound reasonable? And then second, look at your soil test levels. Um, do you need potassium? Do you need sulfur? For many farmers, probably about 70% of the farmers in Alberta don't need potassium. So, but it really gets promoted. Same with micronutrients. There's a lot of promotion of micronutrients, but if your soil test levels are adequate, you don't need it. And more recently, there's been a number of new products come out to make nitrogen fertilizer more efficient. And some of them are actually quite good, but really what I would suggest, if you're looking at a new product, ask them for research evidence from Western Canada by a reputable company or a reputable researcher from a university or Ag Canada to show that how and when their product works. If they can't show you reputable research done in Western Canada, not in Australia or not in Asia, it has to be Alberta research or Western Canada research, soil similar to you. If they can't show that to you, then I'd be very skeptical. And I guess that would be the way I would frame it. Is critical thinking. Does it sound reasonable? Does it make sense? Their claims sound exaggerated. But if they can't give you strong scientific evidence in published papers by a reputable researcher that their product works and how it works, then I would avoid it.
That's excellent advice, Dr. McKenzie. Um, the next question is, what would be a good resource on parent material in Alberta?
Probably the best resource I would suggest is going to the Alberta Agriculture website and look for the Alberta Soil Information Viewer. Um, Alberta Agriculture staff have done a brilliant job of taking all the soil survey reports and putting them into one large map. And so you can actually drill down on that map right to a section basis and even a quarter section basis. And it'll tell you it'll tell you the soil series that you have. The problem is you have to then look up, what is that soil series? Like it might, if you're in southern Alberta, it might say it's a chin loam. Well, I know exactly what that soil series is without even looking it up. A lot of soil series I do, but there's about 10,000. But if you know the soil series, it'll tell you it's a fluvial lacustrine material, it's water deposited, and it'll tell you the approximate soil texture at the surface and at various depths. But if you go to the Alberta Soil Information Viewer and look up your land locations on that viewer, you can see soil textures and hopefully you can understand what some of those things mean, or if you don't, maybe talk to an agronomist to help you interpret some of that more technical soils information.
Perfect, Ross. Thank you. The next one is, where does the microorganisms play in the soil testing? Just understanding of soil playing out in the landscape, lawn maintenance, and gardening. So,
Well, right now, labs don't really test for microorganisms. There's millions of them. If you took a teaspoon of soil, there would be upwards of a billion to 2 billion microorganisms. So try to measure them, it would be very difficult. But microbial activity is something that we're interested in, and so some of the researchers now are looking at respiration. So how much respiration is going on that would give an indication of soil microbial activity. A number of years ago, one of the things that I looked at was an enzyme called phosphatase. Um, Acid phosphatase and alkaline phosphatase are released by microorganisms and plant roots, and I was using that to kind of assess um, because typically um, organisms will release that enzyme, try and stimulate the breakdown of organic phosphorus compounds to make them available for plant or microbial availability. So we're looking at that as a test. So there are a number of different enzymes in soil that we can test for, but and look at soil quality. But that kind of work really isn't being done much in Alberta yet, and it's really in its infancy. But I think that down the road, labs will start to do more tests for even just simple things like respiration to assess soil health. But really, right now, that's not something that the labs do on a routine basis. It's really more on an experimental basis.
that's really interesting. I'm just going to check in with you, Ross. Are you okay? We still have 33 questions. Are you
Oh,
still
is that
good?
right?
Yeah, are you still good? Or
Yeah, we can do a few more, sure.
okay, okay. Well, you tell me
But
when you're ready.
all my advice always comes with a money back guarantee.
Okay,
So
perfect. Okay, our next question is, you mentioned on the last slide more reading. What books or materials would you recommend?
well, I would actually say go to the Alberta Agriculture website and and look at some of the different AgDex publications. And same in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, they have very good publications. And another good source is Montana State University. Our University of Alberta doesn't do much in extension, which is disappointing, but the state universities do a very good job of extension, and so um, Montana State University at Bozeman, Montana, they have a lot of very good information on their website too, and a lot of it is um, some of it is not as applicable because they didn't catch kind of the last glaciation in much of Montana that we did, but a lot of their information is very good and well worth reading. So I would maybe suggest those internet sites would be maybe the first place to start, and then those are often have good references to explore further.
What would the proper management practices be for incorporating gypsum into the farm operation?
Well, I would only be using gypsum on sodic soils. And some people think, well, gypsum is calcium sulfate. You can use that to as a product to like lime is calcium carbonate. and so you can use calcium carbonate to increase soil pH. But for gypsum, it's a neutral salt. You can't use it to change soil pH. So the only reason you put on gypsum is to help reclaim or help reclaim a sodic or a salinitic soil, and it needs to be put on at high enough rates to actually make a difference, and it has to be calculated based on cation exchange capacity and base saturation. So so if that's something they're interested in, I'd refer them to that publication that Shelley Woods and I wrote, managing sodic soils in Alberta. I think that's what it's called. I can't quite remember, but it was managing sodic soils in Alberta. If you just search sodic soils on the Alberta Agriculture website, you'll find the publication, and then use that as your basis for when you might want to put it on. But there's no other reason I would put it on other than if you want to use it as a source of sulfate.
Perfect. What do you think about using worm castings or humic acid on the land?
I don't think much about using just humic acid on the land. I'm not sure what benefit that would be, but in terms of worm castings, I kind of look at it as just another waste product generated by another organism, no different than using poultry manure or hog manure or cattle manure as a nutrient source. So, worm castings, that's just fine, but it would take a lot of worms to really produce very much. But um, I guess that's the way I would look at it. But in terms of using humic acids, I know that there's a researcher at the University of Alberta that I think was maybe going to look at using humic acids. But from what I've read, I would be very optimistic you're going to see a lot of benefit from using humic acid to improve your soil, improve your crop production.
Has man-made synthetic fertilizers and pesticides hurt or helped our soils, and can we reverse it?
I would say for the most part, there's been more benefit than native. For example, like if we look at our regional cropping systems, when European settlers first started cropping our prairie soils, they used the wheat fallow system. Within about 40 to 60 years, our soil organic matter levels declined by about 50%. But then when we started using nitrogen fertilizers to increase crop growth, because we were kind of living on our organic matter, breaking down and releasing nitrogen, and then that we depleted our organic matter levels, we started building those back up by reducing our fallow and by using nitrogen fertilizers. Nitrogen fertilizer had a huge benefit to increase crop yields, but when we increased our crop yields, we were increasing our vegetative growth and root material and organic matter added back to the soil. So they actually had a real benefit by improving our soil quality. But the downside of using nitrogen fertilizers is they also are acidifying. So over time, um, when you put on products like urea or anhydrous ammonia, there's more hydrogen ions released, causing soils to slightly acidify. That's not a problem on irrigated land because the quality of our irrigation water offsets that. On our dry land, we're gradually seeing our surface soil pHs decline, which something I'm very concerned about. And so that's something we're going to have to be, the farmers and researchers in the future are going to have to be very concerned about is our declining soil pHs. So there's been a lot of benefit. There's always a downside, and with most of the pesticides, they break down relatively quickly. They have typically would normally have a very short half-life in our soil, and so they break down quite quickly by the microbes. But there's probably a few that aren't, and so there are some that I am concerned about. And if they don't break down, and if they're used repeatedly, could those concentrations build up to become a problem in the future? So there are some that I'm concerned about. But from a fertilizer standpoint, generally, I'm not worried. By putting on phosphorus or potassium, we're building up our soil quality. But we do have to keep in mind that most sulfate fertilizers and nitrogen fertilizers can be acidifying, and that is a downside we're going to have to address down the road.
Excellent, Ross. Someone wants to know what your opinion on biochar is.
I've never worked with it. Um, if you can get it for a very reasonable price and it has reasonable nutrients in it, they're mostly organic. If you want to put it on, um, it's unlikely it would cause any negative issues, and it could be beneficial. But you'd want to get it for a very, very inexpensive price. Um, that's the way I would look at it. It's like I know that, like manure, I look at it being a great product, and you know what's in it. but you don't want to over apply it. And the same with biochar. If you want to find out, you want to do a test, see what's in it, and if you put it on at 5 tons an acre or 2 tons an acre, what are you actually putting on? But there's really nothing wrong with it. You just want to make sure you know what you're putting on, and manage it appropriately.
That's fair. Excellent critical thinking. Another question, when adding nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, is this synthetic or is there a natural made addition that you can use?
Well, when we're putting on potash, for example, or like potassium, it's actually potassium chloride, and it comes from the mined mineral potash from Saskatchewan. So it's a natural occurring um, mineral that we're just putting on our land. It's been cleaned up, but it's potassium chloride. So you're not only getting potassium, you're getting chloride as well. When we're putting on phosphate, um, phosphate actually occurs naturally in a mineral called apatite, which is mined in Idaho and mostly in Florida, then brought up and processed here. But the mineral apatite is very, the phosphorus in it is locked up in the minerals, and so it has to be processed. So the phosphate will release quickly. So the phosphate fertilizer really comes from a natural source, but is made so it will actually release and be available to plants much more quickly. But with phosphorus and potassium, when you put it on, if you put it on it at 2 inches in the soil, both of them are immobile and they're not going anywhere unless you have very significant soil erosion. That'll stay in the soil. For nitrogen, typically we use natural gas to take nitrogen from the air. 80% of the air we breathe is nitrogen gas, and so then we convert that into NH3, like anhydrous ammonia, which is NH3, or we can then convert it over to ammonia fertilizer, urea fertilizer, or then there's other products like ammonium nitrate or ammonium sulfate. But typically the starting point is natural gas and nitrogen in the air, and that's how we make our commercial fertilizers. And they're completely pure. There's nothing wrong with them. They're very pure. But the downside is when we are putting on um, a synthetic fertilizer like um, urea or anhydrous ammonia, they are acidifying. So that's just reality.
Fair. We have someone who's a pumpkin grower, and they say that soil sampling is not a common thing to do to maximize their crop. They've been using mycorrhizal in their pumpkin growing, and they want to know if that's something that is cost effective or not cost effective in grain crops.
Um, there's really nothing that we have kind of available like these mycorrhizal products that are really commercially available right now. At least nothing I'm aware of. I know there are some biological products that are coming available and being promoted. Some of them I'm not sure that they really work very well. But in terms of mycorrhizal products for wheat, barley, and canola, I'm really not aware of any. There might be some out there that have come out recently that I'm just not aware of. But um, the way I look at it, we have many different types of mycorrhizal organisms that occur naturally in our soils, and so do we. Like I said before, a tablespoon of soil, it could be 2 billion microorganisms. So if we put on another 10 or 20 microbes on a seed, well, would it really be that beneficial to them? And I'm not aware of any products right now that will do that.
Okay. Someone's asking that near the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned a resource, they believe through Alberta Ag, to help with determining soil texture. What was that resource again, please?
Oh, actually, just go back to the Alberta Soil Information Viewer. It's on the Alberta Agriculture website where they've taken all of the soil survey data for the entire province. And you can drill down to the range and township where you are, and then drill down to your lands, right down to quarter sections, and you can look at the soil survey, and they'll have soil series listed and the soil textures. And that'd be the place where I would go because that'll give you a pretty good indication of the range of the soil textures on the surface. And typically they'll even give you, as you scroll down, they'll even talk about not just the topsoil, but the B and the C horizon and what the textures are there as well, and give you a range. So that's where I would go. And then the other way is just to go out into the field yourself, and there's a little handle we used to have, and just by manual texturing the soil, you can feel it. You could actually, through a process of elimination, you can decide is that a sandy loam or a clay loam or a silty clay loam. You can actually feel the soil and see what it actually feels like. And I'm not bad at it, but I'm kind of rusty now. But we used to be able to, when we're doing all of our soil sampling, we're doing our research trials, that'd always be soil texturing to see what the soil texture like. And so you can actually get quite good within 10% of what the soil texture is. So, but looking at the soil survey maps would be a good starting point.
Ross, you're giving me flashbacks to Soils 210.
Mm-hmm.
Another question for you. There's lots of work being done in the ag industry in regards to defining soil health and using soil carbon, soil respiration, or POXC as the measure for the health. Do you have any additional thoughts on these methods and their accuracy to describe soil health?
Well, I think that the way I look at it is that measuring soil respiration down the road is could probably be fairly useful. But um, if you took a soil respiration on a soil sample from a hilltop versus a mid-slope position versus a lower slope position, you're going to get three different numbers. And what is that going to really tell you? And how should you change your management? And really, in my mind, um, without knowing the respiration, just by knowing what the quality of the soil is like, looking at the soil quality, the soil colors, the soil profile. I would be talking to the farmer to talk about maybe manuring hilltops, and if they don't have that access to feedlot or livestock manure of some sort, I'd be encouraging them to make sure they're continuously cropping using diverse crop rotations, continuously cropping, soil testing, adequately fertilizing, and in years where it's a little wetter, put on a little extra nitrogen on the hilltops just to get that better growth if you have good moisture. But in years like this year, there's no point in over fertilizer and extra nitrogen because water is going to be a limiting factor. But I would tend to maybe put less reliability on measuring some of these more obscure things like respiration. What does it really tell you? There's a lot of other things that I would use to tell me what the soil health is like, try and build soil quality.
Awesome. In the gray wooded zone, what can a producer expect to have as a residual from dairy slurry or manure in subsequent years and dairy straw manure? So I'm thinking they're looking at what the impact might be on their soils.
Well, I would see about maybe if they're up in the Peace River region, maybe sending some samples of their liquid slurry to and to element labs and have it analyzed to see how much is in there. So, for every gallon they put on, they know what they're actually applying in terms of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur. That would be very good information. And then that would help them understand, how many gallons per acre should I be putting on to build up your soil. And then um, I guess I'd also be interested in knowing the amount of nitrogen in there, like is it to 1% or 2% organic matter? Typically, it's quite low. But then most odds are that probably most of that nitrogen is going to release in the first 2 years after application. It's probably going to release fairly quickly, where the phosphorus and potassium will last for much longer time periods. But probably after that is applied for the first 2 years after you applied, if you put on a high enough rate, you shouldn't have to use nitrogen fertilizer, and you should have a benefit for anywhere from 3 to maybe as 10 years, depending on how much of the slurry you put on for phosphorus and potassium, where you may not need to actually put that on as a commercial fertilizer.
Perfect. Some tests I have recommend applying 5 pounds of Cu, which is copper. I usually apply 0.5 to 1 pounds. Are there any concerns with this high of a rate?
Um, to be honest, if you are going to take you're going to apply copper sulfate at 5 pounds, and there's nothing wrong with that. I would be doing that. If I did it, I'd be doing it with a kind of the plan. If I'm going to put that on, then you should be good for at least 5 years. Sorry, not 5 years. You're probably going to be good for at least 5 years, but more than likely 10 or even more years. You put on a high enough rate, you've built your copper levels up. Copper is not mobile, it's not going anywhere, and it'll be there for for a number of years, so then you don't have to put on repeated applications. But I'm not sure what the cost of copper is now, but I think it's up in the range of $5 a pound. So you're putting on 5 pounds, that could be $25 an acre. That's quite expensive. And so you have to ask yourself, is it really worth it? Um, but if you can afford it and you put it on, and if it's a younger farmer and you know he's going to be farming there for the next 10 or 15 years, it might be worth it to put it on now. And then you build your copper levels up and then monitor your soil test level, but then you shouldn't have to put on copper for quite a number of years.
And there's no toxicity concerns.
No,
No.
no, with some micronutrients, there is like if somebody said they want to put on 5 pounds of boron, um, it would turn my hair white. Oh no, my hair already is white. I'm kidding. But 5 pounds of boron would be very toxic. But 5 pounds of copper is not. So for the metal micronutrients, to put on a couple of pounds of zinc and a couple of pounds of copper, it's not a problem at all. But boron can be quite toxic, and the lower the soil pH, the more toxic it's going to be. So if you put on a 3 pound application of boron on your crop, it could be quite toxic, depending on your conditions. So, but I wouldn't be worried about the copper.
Okay. How many soil cores should be taken for a soil analysis on, say, an acre of cropland?
Um, well, I guess I would maybe look at it differently. I'd look at the size of your field. If you have a quarter section and it's quite uniform, um, I would say I would encourage you to take at least 25 cores in that 160 acre field. If you're going to do what we call benchmark sampling, you're just going to go to 1 acre and soil sample it, and you use that and go back to that same location, assuming that that 1 acre is going to be representative of, say, a number of acres, like say an 80 or 100 acre parcel, but you're going to just sample that 1 acre. I would still take at least 20 cores in that 1 acre, but you want a real good representation. If you only take 5 or 6 cores and you happen to hit a hot spot of phosphorus or like a phosphorus fertilizer band or something like that, that could really throw things out. But if you get at least 20 or 25 cores, then that's going to give you a good average and a much better representation of what the field is like. The fewer samples you take, the less likely it might be representative. You might hit a hot spot or a saline spot or something like that that could skew the results of the analysis.
That's fair. Here's a good one that I want to know the answer to too. If you take a soil sample in the dead of the winter, is it accurate?
Odds are it could be, or it probably should be. Um, I actually prefer to soil sample in late fall as close to freeze up as possible. So, sampling in late October is kind of my preference because typically nutrients won't change much from fall till spring. This will be an exception this year when with our very warm soil temperatures. It's quite possible that we're going to see nutrient change from fall till spring, especially in southern Alberta when we have bare soils and we've got we have air temperatures in that 10 to 15 range, so we can start to get a bit of microbial activity, and things will change. But just assuming if you can, and the other problem is making sure that you can actually core in that frozen soil. So that soil is frozen hard. You have to be able to core into it. And odds are you're going to have to use about a 2 inch core too, with a lot of weight on the truck to push that core all the way down to 24 inches. As long as you can clearly separate the 0 to 6, 6 to 12, and 12 to 24 inch depth, and take those samples back into your shop, let them air dry and thaw out and air dry, then package them up and send them to the lab. Odds are that they could be quite reasonable. But one of the problems is that sampling soil, frozen soil, can be very difficult, and so getting the right depths can be a challenge. So some people, what they'll do is they'll actually drill rather than core. And if you're drilling, you're getting disturbance, and you're not exactly sure where that sample is coming from. Is it 0 to 6 inches or 0 to 8 inches? And then that could dilute your 0 to 6 inch depth sample.
That makes perfect sense, Ross. I was thinking you could sell people gym memberships to take soil samples in
Yep.
the
Or
winter.
have me come out and help.
Yeah,
Yeah,
perfect.
I'm just kidding.
What do you think of nitrogen stabilizers such as ESN? Is it worth the extra cost? Are there benefits beyond slow release, such as less seed burn?
ESN is a very good product. We started working it with the prototypes of ESN before it was called ESN back in the late 90s. And I think ESN was finally released and made available to Alberta farmers in about 2006. We did a lot of work with ESN. in various prototype forms, and then it was I can't remember the names now, but there was several different forms where 20-day release and 40-day release. We did a lot of work with those, but ESN certainly is a good product. It certainly protects the nitrogen from loss. Basically, it's a plastic polymer coating on the urea, and when you put that fertilizer granule in the soil, um, water moves into the granule through the porous membrane of the polymer, dissolves the fertilizer, and then it slowly diffuses back out of that's coating, and then is released to the soil, and the microbes converted to an available form of nitrate. So it certainly works. Um, the question is, do you have conditions for loss? If you're a farmer in the brown and dark brown soils, we often don't have conditions in the spring that are conducive to the nitrogen fertilizer losses. You started moving to the black and the gray soils, particularly when conditions are wet, sometimes you can run into losses. You get some heavy rains after seeding. Um, that slow release can prevent some of that nitrogen loss, whether it's through leaching or denitrification. So I would say it tends to be more beneficial to farmers in wet years in central Alberta, like in the black and the gray soils. It tends to be less beneficial to farmers in dryland farmers in southern Alberta, where we don't often have those kind of conditions for loss. If you only have those kind of conditions for loss, maybe 1 in 6 years, it's not really worth the effort. But if it's 1 out of 2 years in central Alberta, then it would be. But the product certainly does work. And then the question about seed safety, that was one of the things that we found in our work when we were seed placing versus side banding versus deep banding, the incredible seed safety that Agrium at the time, which was the developer, I hadn't really thought of. But from a seed safety standpoint, it works quite well also. So you can certainly put more with the seed. If you're in a single shoot system where you're putting a lot of your fertilizer down with the seed, you can certainly put more nitrogen down with the seed um, versus if you're using urea. But with urea, I'm actually quite cautious. So yes, the product works. Depending on your conditions, it may or may not be beneficial.
How's your crystal ball?
Well, I think I'm ready for a beer right now, but anyway,
Do you want to do a few more questions,
we
Ross?
can do a couple more, sure.
Okay. When reviewing a soil test report, what may be an indication of a testing mistake?
Um, well, the first thing I look at is the information on the soil test report. Uh, Making sure you look at the land locations. Does the land location seem correct? And typically you'll maybe give them the previous crop and the crop you plan to grow and make sure that information is correct. A lot of farmers have field names for if they have a legal land location, but they might have a field name, so make sure that that information all adds up. That's the first thing I would look for. Generally, the labs are fairly good with their quality control. I know when we used to have Agriculture used to have our lab, our government lab, and did farmer samples. Every 10th sample that went through the lab was a standard sample, so it was very easy to pick out if if there was instrumentation or something that wasn't working right. You'd pick that up very quickly. And I think the soil testing labs in Lethbridge and Edmonton, I think they tend to have pretty good quality control. But you look at something like soil pH. If it seems unusually high or unusually low compared to what you've seen in that same field in previous years, that would be maybe a red flag. So typically something like pH, soil organic matter, um, electrical conductivity on the surface soil. If you had a history of sampling that field, then you look at the soil sample this year and they're different, that might be a bit of a red flag. Maybe there was a mistake in the sampling. Maybe the fertilizer got samples mixed up, or maybe there was a sample mix up in the lab. But those would be what I would look at. Look at those factors that don't change much from year to year, and compare to 1 and 2 and 3 years previously. See how they compare, and if they're all the same, and then this sample is quite different, that would be an indicator that something's gone wrong somewhere, perhaps in a soil sampling, or in mix up in the labs, and when they're being boxed up, or when they were being unpackaged and set up in the lab.
Makes sense. How can one increase their pH without increasing calcium? I have high calcium, but pH between 5 and 6.
Um, Well, really, lime, which is calcium carbonate, is really the only product we can use to bump up our soil pH, and it's a two-step process. Um, and to be honest, I really wouldn't worry about bumping up your calcium levels. That will increase the calcium percentage on the exchange complex somewhat, but I don't think I'd be that worried about it. I'd be more concerned about the effect of low pH. If your pH is at 5 and you want to get up to 6 or 6.5, lime is the best way to do it. And the reality is you're going to bump up your lime on exchange complex, but I don't really see that as a bad thing, to be honest.
Perfect. And here's another question for you. And they're suggesting it might be unanswerable. I work on a reserve, Maskwacis, Alberta, managing agricultural leases. There is a great concern regarding the soil quality of our lands after decades of farming and no monitoring of soil and farming practices for what's happening on that leased reserve land. What do you recommend we ask our leasee, the farmers, to provide us so that we can see what is actually happening to our soil? We have no starting data to compare to. Some farmers are using agronomists and some are not.
Yep, that's a very good question. I know other reserves have run into the same problem. I know I've helped with the blood tribe on the blood reserve southeast of or southwest of Lethbridge with this very same question. And usually what I suggest is yeah, decide that all farmers must soil test every year. Perhaps have one company be hired or several companies hired that will do all the sampling and set up the standard way of doing it, like 0 to 6, 6 to 12, 12 to 24 inches, how many samples have to be taken each field. And then all the samples must be sent to the same lab every year. So they might decide to send the samples to Lethbridge, or in this case, they might go to Edmonton to Element Labs, but they use the same soil testing lab using the same analyses year after year. You can't use an Alberta lab this year and an Eastern Canada lab next year and another lab in the States next year, because everybody's using different analyses and equipment. So you want to use the same lab year after year and be consistent. And so you want to set up your standards of how the fields will be sampled and by who, and then stick to that year after year. And then gradually you'll develop a database. But your first year will be your starting point. That'll be your baseline. And so you want to do kind of a full analysis, including things like base saturation and cation exchange capacity. You have a very good indication what your soils are like. That's your baseline. And using that same lab, testing for the basic every year after year, and maybe once every 5 years, test for micronutrients if you don't need them. Test every 5 years, 10 years, and 15 years, but just be very consistent. But that would be a very wise thing to do. But it would be a requirement for every leaseholder. They must soil sample every fall and provide those soil test results. And if they don't get to farm the land next year. And I'd be very hard-nosed about it. It's their land. They want to manage it very well, and you want to have a database to monitor the land and how the quality is improving, or is pH declining, is organic matter going up, and kind of what's going on, and have a very good baseline of information.
Perfect. Solonetic soils with a BNT horizon. Does how much does subsoiling help with breaking up the hard pan? And if anyone has studied this before?
Yep. There was a lot of work done by the University of Alberta. If you actually really go back to the early 70s, there was Agriculture Canada had a research center at Vegreville. That was kind of in the heart of the Solonitic soil country, and Ross Cairns was a researcher at that time. He did a lot of excellent work looking at deep plowing and of Solonitic soils and how they could be managed. In the 80s and 90s, Jerome Lickitz, who worked for Alberta Agriculture, did a lot of very good work on managing Solonitic soils. And you can actually go to the Alberta Agriculture website and view the summaries of his AgDex publications that he wrote. He was an excellent fellow, did some very good work and very good recommendations on the influence of deep plowing. So deep plowing can be successful, but solonitic soils are so variable across landscapes. And we have that BNT horizon. We have true solonitic soils, solidized solonitic, and solodic soils. There are different subcategories of solonitic soil. Solodics can be reclaimed much more easily than those true soil-netic soils that have that very strong BNT horizon. And but I would kind of refer this person to the Alberta Agriculture website, Managing Soil-Netic Soils, and read that fact sheet.
Do you know of a granular lime or calcium product that can be banded?
There are products out there that you can ban. They're quite expensive, and I just offhand I've forgotten the names of them. But to be honest, if you're actually going to really apply lime and really truly change the soil pH, oftentimes you're going to be looking at having to put 1 to 2 tons per acre on. And so if you're best spending on 100 pounds of lime, odds are it's going to have minimal effect. And the thing is, after you apply that lime, you want to spread, you want it very finely divided, spread it on the soil surface, and really well incorporate. You want to disc it in and really get it mixed in. And so then it can start working and changing the soil pH. If you band it, you're going to have at low rates in a granular form, you're going to have minimal impact. And if farmers are kind of looking, well, I want to try it, but it's hard to find. Um, Atlantic in Tabor, it's the sugar factory in Tabor. They use basically it's agricultural lime to clean up the sugar in their processing. So they've got about 2 million tons of waste lime on their grounds. They will give away to farmers for free. So if a farmer's wanting to try some lime, they can actually get it free by contacting Atlantic in Tabor. All you have to do is pay for the loading. You bring your truck down, you load it up to pay them for the loading, and you can take it away free. And then you can spread it on your land on a trial base to see how it might work. And that's a they're if it's something if that's something farmers are interested in trying on a test strip basis, that'd be a great place to go and get some agricultural lime for free and try it out on their farm.
That's perfect, Ross. With the fertility costs up and commodity prices down, considering some cover cropping with a mixture including legumes for green manure. Curious if any work has been done in Alberta with cover cropping to build soil health, fertility, and bring up deeper soil fertility.
There's not been a lot of work. I think there's a couple of applied research associations are trying to do a bit of cover crop work, and there's a few agronomists that are working with farmers to try it, but it's really in its infancy. Um, and actually, Les Henry, who used to be a prof at the University of Saskatchewan, writes articles for Grain News. He actually had an article a few issues ago, and he was very negative on cover crops. But that was from his perspective. He's even older than I am, so that's saying something. But he had an interesting article. To be honest, I'm also kind of cool on cover crops from a protection standpoint because, but that's from a Southern Alberta perspective. We're so short on moisture already. The cover crop is just going to use up moisture. So I'm I'm kind of cool on cover crops for the south, but as you move into central Alberta where we have better moisture conditions, it is something you can look at. I know that in some of the long-term rotation trials we had a while in the brown soil zone, one of the things we looked at was um, growing some different pulses to fix nitrogen. So we would grow wheat, and then we'd have, instead of having a fallow year, we'd grow like the chickling vetch, or there are different there was I forget the name of the legume that we grew. It was specifically for fixing nitrogen, and then we would just either spray it out or cultivate it out, and then we'd seed wheat in year 3. So we'd have wheat, um, pulse crop growing strictly to fix nitrogen. But we would terminate it beginning in July, and then we'd crop to wheat again the next year. And it actually worked okay, but it was very expensive. We found that seed, so we ended up switching to peas. And then one year we couldn't get them off, we couldn't get them terminated, and then we harvested them, and then we went to just a straight pea wheat rotation. It worked beautifully. So, but one of the problems with cover crops, so is it will tend to use up moisture, and you don't really get a lot of direct benefit, but we'll get indirect benefit by that nitrogen fixing action. But to include a pulse crop, well, there's a few different ones that will fix nitrogen, but would you want to really use it? Like the seed costs for these pulse crops tend to be fairly expensive, and you might be better just to grow wheat one year and then peas the next, or preferably you grow peas and then grow a crop like wheat, and you'll get that nitrogen release benefit and higher protein levels the year after you grow the peas with your hard red spring wheat. So um, I think I might look at, I would look at some options. I would do some reading, maybe have them read Les Henry's article in Grain News from a few weeks ago, just to get a different opinion. But um, I guess I've read all I can say about cover crops. There's not been a lot of work done with them.
Perfect. Do you have an opinion on a product called Atlas XC? It's a fertilizer catalyst to help you get more out of your applied phosphate and potassium.
I'm certainly aware of it. It's been strongly promoted. And I know that there's a few different people who have been doing field tests with it, but they're not replicated. They're just test strips. And I have a real problem with it's test strips to compare things that, you know, especially for products like this. And they really need to have, in my opinion, more scientific testing to really prove that they work. But I know that they are certainly being promoted. I'd certainly like to see more actual documented field research by unbiased sources, not the people that are selling it to be convinced that it works. But I've heard some promising comments from farmers, but I would really like to see some strong research to really prove to me that it actually works in 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 well laid out replicated research trials.
Floating on ammonium sulfate and potassium in the fall, are there any concerns for loss of effectiveness?
Well, ammonium sulfate, I wouldn't be too concerned unless you're broadcasting onto a high pH soil. There's some potential loss for the ammonium portion, the NH4 portion of the sulfate, but the sulfate is, when you're broadcasting ammonium sulfate, the sulfate is mobile, so any rains would move it in, but you could potentially, on a higher pH soil, lose some of that ammonium to volatile, just to gaseous loss. It changes from a NH4 to NH3, which is ammonia, and you lose it back to the air. And then for potassium, potassium is not mobile, so it'll sit on the soil surface. So if you broadcast that on, and you're in a direct seeded situation, that potassium will just stay on the soil surface, and you're going to get minimal benefit from it. So I'd much prefer to see. I don't have a problem with the broadcasted ammonium sulfate for the most part, but I would recommend that the potassium be side banded or mid row banded, several inches into the soil, so then plant roots would have easier access to it because it's an immobile nutrient.
So I wanted to summarize with this last comment rather than a question because it reflects lots of the views that folks have shared within the Q&A. Thank you very much, Dr. Ross. I am my own researcher on my own land, but it's time we rejuvenated soil research in post-secondary. It's fascinating. Thank you. So
Sure.
I need to thank you so much on behalf of the Living Lab and the over 100 participants who joined us tonight for over nearly 2.5 hours of excellence and knowledge. Your depth and breadth of knowledge and cropping and fertilizers is phenomenal. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise that you've shared with us tonight.
Yep, I'm more than happy to do it. I wasn't going anywhere in a hurry tonight, and as long as I'm rested up for skiing tomorrow, I'll be just fine. So
That's all that
anyway,
matters.
I'm always happy to share my thoughts and opinions for what they're worth. So thanks for having me, and hopefully it was helpful.
It was fantastic. Thank you so much. Good luck on the slopes tomorrow.
I'm sure I'll have fun. It's skiing is awful, but I still have fun.
Perfect. That's all.
The snow conditions are awful, but I still have fun.
Perfect.
Anyway, good
Perfect.
talking
Thank you,
to talk to you.
everyone. Thank
Okay,
you.
bye.
Take care.